At this point, I think everyone in Cardano has seen firsthand that governance is ugly and messy, full of compromise, never perfect, and definitely never exactly what you, as an individual member of the community, would want. I think that's true for all of us. But at the same time, I think given how messy governance always is, I think things have been progressing pretty smoothly for Cardano governance. And I even think we might be winning. If the only winning you want to hear about involves price goes up, or if you're finding value in these videos, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies DRep address and the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, I wouldn't call this progress. I would call this a whole lot of drama and lack of progress. But it's all relative. When you compare this, what's going on in Cardano, to what's happening in, we'll call it air quotes, professional governance in North America, Europe, even certain countries in Asia over the last couple of years, what we see is opposing political parties trying to jail each other's leaders and declaring those opposing political parties to be illegal. That's happened just like in the last couple of weeks in some of the most like countries that would be regarded as having the most, you know, democratic, modern, industrialized societies in all of the world. That's what's happening in professional governance in the most advanced countries in the world right now. In Cardano, I think we're doing fairly well comparatively. And what's happened so far is we've had to hash out a few issues. And I think we've done it pretty successfully. We've kind of come to consensus on a few issues after a lot of spirited discussion because everybody in Cardano was very passionate about Cardano. And that's how you want it. You want everybody to be very engaged and passionate. And the result of that is that people are expressive about their opinions. I'll put it that way. Maybe that's a charitable way of putting it, but that's the way I'm going to say it today. People are very expressive about their opinions, and people have conflicting opinions, and we hash those out and we come to a consensus. That's what's happened so far on the net change limit. There was a net change limit of 350. We talked about this in the last video. You know my opinion. I don't want to engage in deficit spending, especially not in our very first budget. It's like Cardano was based, we'll say all of crypto really has a strong basis in sort of Austrian economics. And to engage in deficit spending in our very first budget, the very first chance we really get in Cardano, doesn't seem to be consistent with the ethos of Cardano, of crypto in general for me. However, that 350 million net change limit, of course, eventually the community reached consensus and everybody was comfortable with that. The portion of us who weren't comfortable with it, of course, voted in favor of the 200 million net change limit, which is much closer to something that doesn't involve deficit spending. But the much larger portion of the DRep votes so far have gone for that 350 million net change limit. So we did pretty good. There was a difference of opinion. I wouldn't even go so far as to call it a schism in the community over what the net change limit should be, but the governance model did what it's supposed to do. The votes were enough to push forward that 350 million net change limit, and a 200 million change limit was subsequently put forward, and it could achieve a large amount of adoption over the coming weeks. But so far, the consensus is towards that 350 million net change limit. So the model is working so far, even though there's a lot of spirited, expressive, passionate discussion on social media. So far, the model works. We had competing views of what that number should be, and consensus moved toward one number versus the other. So far, the system is working. And I think it's also working with the other important items here. That is, okay, we know the net change limit has to be below 350. We know the budget number has to be below 350 because that's the net change limit. What should that budget number be? What should be in the budget? If there's consensus about certain big items that should be in the budget, what percentage share of the budget should those items have? And that's where I think we're making progress even right now. Even as I'm recording, we're sort of finalizing a vote on a piece of that that was a little bit controversial for a second, but I think we're sort of hashing even that part out right now. And that's this piece right here. I think we had already achieved consensus on the three big Cardano IOG budget proposals, those being sort of IOG engineering, IOG research, IOG catalyst proposal. Those three proposals received a large number of votes. I voted yes for all three of those. And a lot of the rest of the DReps did as well. So it looks like we have enough votes to pass those pieces. There was another problem though. The next piece that I think we're hashing out right now is the intersect piece. So I think everybody in crypto, everybody in Cardano, everybody who's a human in the world probably agrees they hate bureaucracy. I think we all hate bureaucracies. And yet they seem to not only exist everywhere, but proliferate and multiply and reproduce themselves. It's amazing how bureaucracies pop up like viruses spreading, and the institutional inertia behind them is such that they only get bigger and bigger and bigger. We all hate that. We all know. But it also seems to be something that's with us. Much like viruses in general, we cannot seem to shake them. They're with us. They seem to be with us forever. And in Cardano, we're getting a front row seat to why bureaucracies are so omnipresent, right? So we always had IOG, Emergo, and the Cardano Foundation doing everything for us. And a lot of that was done under the hood. Like, for instance, we would find out that a fork was coming. And we all just sort of had this, like, community consensus, like, oh, yeah, we want, we'll go back to Goguen. Like, it's like, yeah, we all want smart contracts. So we're all in favor of this Goguen fork. And it all just kind of happened under the hood for us as normal members of the community. That was not the case for IOG. IOG had a lot of things going on. Like, obviously, Emergo, the CF, and IOG all had keys that were required for those forks. And we've had a lot of discussion in the past on this channel about how it looked like IOG was probably being the custody of those keys at certain times for the CF and for Emergo, but all that was kind of happening under the hood for us, and we didn't really have to worry about it before. But now we've gotten to this point in crypto where we have senators like Lummis and Gillibrand, who are certainly friends of crypto, who are putting forward real legislative regulatory frameworks for crypto. They're going to pass some laws that are going to be good for crypto, but they're going to involve real regulatory frameworks for crypto that we've never really had before. We've just had, you know, crypto hating SECs that were just sort of, saying the law was whatever they wanted it to be on any given week to make it as hard as possible for crypto. But now we're going to have real common sense crypto regulation that is predictable and sustainable and makes sense to everybody in and outside of crypto. But a part of that is that blockchains, in order to get the most preferential treatment, are going to have to be decentralized, including the governance of those blockchains. So we reached this point when it became clear that maybe some of those legislative frameworks might get passed. Maybe Lummis and Gillibrand might get their legislative framework passed. That seems to be one of the front runners, at least elements of it. And an element that all of these good frameworks had in common was that governance couldn't have been in the hands of just one entity like IOG, or even just three entities like Emergo and the CF. It had to be decentralized. Everything had to be decentralized. And of course, the model they were going off there was the case study they sort of had in mind when they created those frameworks was Bitcoin. Bitcoin kind of has an easy road because Bitcoin can say, its governance is completely decentralized because they basically do no governance. You've got miners mining, and for any kind of a fork to happen, all the miners have to agree, and they all have to, enough of the miners have to point their mining rigs at this new consensus model of how the blockchain, how the ledger is kept in order for anything to happen. That's why when We had the block size war. That's why Bitcoin Cash did not become the dominant block, because most of the miners decided to stay on the original Bitcoin consensus model and not this new Bitcoin Cash consensus model, which involved bigger blocks. So we already know how that works in Bitcoin, and they basically never are able to upgrade or add smart contracts or evolve in any way, because the miners are all just going to keep mining on that exact same consensus model. In Cardano, we have bigger ambitions. We want to do far, far more than Bitcoin's ever capable of doing, but at the same time, we also need to meet these new legislative frameworks that are kind of designed for stuff that looks a lot more like Bitcoin, where there's no single entity, there's no Satoshi, there's no IOG, there's no Emergo, there's no CF that has the keys. And IOG has been very, very smart. They recognize this very, very early, and they let us know, hey, we're going to retire from this position we've been in previously, where we're holding the keys and we're doing everything and we're managing the forks and we're managing the budget, we're managing the treasury. They knew that wouldn't fly under these regulatory frameworks. So they let us know IOG is going to move out of that position. So the community is going to have to do everything. None of it's going to happen invisibly under the hood anymore. It's all going to have to be done by the community. Of course, the community is decentralized. So we can't, without some centralized entity managing that on the part of the decentralized community, none of that would ever get done. Like, we'd never be able to get forks done. We'd never be able to manage disbursements from the treasury, right? It's like we can all agree, like, hey, we want to give IOG a bunch of money. And that's what we just did over the last month. We all agreed that we all liked, or at least enough of us liked, the three big IOG proposals: the engineering proposal, the research proposal, and the catalyst proposal. Enough of the DReps voted yes on those that it's clear there's a consensus in the community that those should be funded. However, just saying, yes, those things are a good idea doesn't move money from the treasury to IOG. Somebody's actually got to make those transactions. And then somebody's got to do the oversight on that and check back with those entities that we give money to make sure they do what they said they would do. We don't want to get rugged. We don't want the whole blockchain ecosystem to get rugged if we give some amount of money to any particular actor in the ecosystem. Because let's face it, it's not always going to be an IOG or some other entity we all know and love. There's going to be a lot of other entities. And if there's no oversight, if there's no audits, if there's nobody checking, the community would get rugged, because that's a commonality in all of crypto. So there are certain things that we need somebody to do that IOG used to do invisibly under the hood for us, like manage the code repositories, right? Like, um, at base, on an abstract level, the blockchain is software, right? There's this consensus protocol, this about how the ledger should be run, and it's memorialized in code, and somebody's got to keep. We put that code in code repositories, and somebody's got to be the custodian of those code repositories, right? This is all stuff that IOG did for us previously, but somebody's got to do it. So IOG knew they couldn't fulfill that role anymore under the new regulatory frameworks, nor did they really want to, because they wanted to give Cardano to the community. So we got the birth of Intersect, a member-based organization. And like I said just a few minutes ago, nobody loves a bureaucracy, but we've got certain things that have to be done. Somebody's got to manage those disbursements for the treasury. Somebody's got to manage those code repositories. Somebody's got to do some of these invisible things that IOG did for us before. So we need something that looks something that's going to play a lot of the same roles that Intersect has proposed for itself to play, but that all can't happen for free. All these complex, small, under the hood things, somebody's got to do them. And there aren't volunteers who are competent and willing to do these things. Somebody's got to get paid to do those things. So we've got to fund some entity has to be funded to do these things. The question was, how much money do we give to that entity? So previously we got a proposal from Intersect for 20 million ADA, and it was just labeled as a 2025 proposal. So people started thinking, okay, 20 million ADA, What if the price just goes back up to previous all-time highs? What if it goes back to $3? Then you're really talking about $60 million. And this money, the earliest this money, could possibly be dispersed would be like, a month from now, like the end of May. So there's really only 7 months left in the year. So we're talking about giving somebody $70 million for 7 months of work. That seemed like way, 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 way too much to a lot of people. So DReps did not vote in big enough numbers to approve that prior proposal that Intersect made on the uh, the Ecclesia system that they had put together for budget reconciliation. Not enough DReps voted in favor of that proposal. In fact, DReps were voting pretty strongly against that proposal. So instead, we got this proposal. This is a proposal not for 20 million and not just for those 7 months of 2025. This is a proposal for 2025 and 2026. So we come down here to proposal details. We can see that this is a proposal that would be relevant to June 2025 to June 2026, and it's not for 20 million; it's for 15.75 million. So I tend to ignore these dollar amounts that every proposal seems to have in it because they all value the ADA at 50 cents. We all know ADA is not currently 50 cents, and let's face it, if we all thought that 50 cents was as high as ADA is going to go in 2025, probably not very many of us would be here. Not very many people would be here if we thought that ADA for the rest of the year was going to go down to 50 cents and just stay at 50 cents or lower. That's not what the community has in mind for ADA for 2025. So I tend to ignore these dollar values, except in most proposals, except in this proposal. There's something else going on here. So in this proposal, let me see if I can find it. Somewhere. Okay, here we go. Any surplus will be swept back into the treasury. So what they're saying is that they're going to peg this not to the ADA amount because they know that could fluctuate. They're going to peg this amount to this dollar amount, and any surplus will be swept back into the treasury. And I know you're thinking, hey, it's a little ambiguous. That's not exactly what it looks like that says. We'll address that in just a second because the X post they made kind of clarifies that part. But what's important to notice here is that we're no longer dealing with just June to December 2025. We're now dealing with June to June 2026. So this is one of the few proposals that we've seen in the past couple of weeks that actually goes for 12 months. The rest of them just called themselves 2025 proposals so that as soon as we get to 2026, they can say, hey, all that money's gone. Now we need 2026 money. Instead, this is an actual 12-month proposal. So it's instead of 7 months, we're looking at 12 months. They've almost doubled the amount of time this is going to apply to. Okay, on the award being tied to the dollar figure, check out this thread from Intersect. So we come down here to section 5, reduced and capped budget ask. Our request has been reduced from 20 million to 15.75, tied to a USD equivalent of 7.875 million. Funds will be dispersed quarterly through a multi-sig enabled smart contract. Any unused ADA will be returned to the treasury. And down here, they talk about the time period. The revised proposal now covers a clean 12-month period from June to June, 25 to 26. All retrospective funding has been removed. So we've got the award pegged to the dollar figure. And so the way I'm interpreting this is if we go back to all-time highs and they're somehow able to sell an amount of ADA equal to 7.875 million USD, and they still have a bunch of ADA left over. Um, the way I'm reading this is that the unused ADA will be returned to the treasury, but this is also happening through quarterly disbursements. So this could happen every quarter. What I'm guessing is that a certain amount of ADA will be dispersed to them. It'll be, that quarter's portion of this total 7.875 million, and they'll be selling it. The price will either be, above or below that 50-cent figure. And if it's above, I'm hoping that I'm interpreting this as the total amount of USD they get will not be above that amount. And that's certainly what I'm reading here. Our request is tied to a USD equivalent of 7.875 million. Any unused data will be returned to the Treasury. This is a very different proposal. This proposal is a very different proposal than the one we got before. The one we got before is 20 million for the 7-month period. No talk of unused data being returned to the Treasury. And now we're getting, hey, it's 7.875 million USD, 12 months, not 7 months. And if we have this situation where we go back to all-time highs, if ADA is suddenly worth $3, we're not going to say, okay, we get, over 45 million USD. I'm interpreting this, and I believe their intent is to express that the total award will not exceed 7.8 million USD. Very, very different proposal. This is progress. So, with this much better intersect proposal, where does that leave those parts of the community that don't want to engage in deficit spending? We've already said, the whole crypto ethos is like heavily grounded in Austrian economics, and not deficit spending such that the central banks have to inflate the money to cover, to devalue the debt that's involved in the deficit spending. All of those things we've talked about so many times on this channel. So what do we do now if we don't want to be engaged in deficit spending? So you'll remember that we were already kind of at the limit of how much we've been told came into the treasury in 2024. In fact, I posted about this not too long ago when I reported the results of my votes on 177 different proposals in the Intersect DRep budget reconciliation process, that whole thing. So all of my votes on those budgets, all my yes votes, amounted to a total budget of 195,277 and 88 ADA. And because all of those budget proposals were just those 7-month kind of budgets, they were just 2025. If you annualize that number for 12 months, you came to this figure of 334,760,722, which is just under the amount of 335,957,093 that we've been told was the amount of income the Treasury saw in 2024. That's in the 350 million net change limit proposal. You can go back and check that if you want to see that actually in the proposal. So we were right up against. If you say that those budgets were just for the remaining 7 months of 2025, we were right up to the point where we would start doing deficit spending. But then you've got this other argument that, hey, actually, we didn't give them any money in the first 5 months of 2025. So even though there's only 7 months left, this is kind of a little bit of a retroactive award of funds to cover those first 5 months as well. So you could argue either that this is an annualized budget, going forward of 334 million, or it's really just a budget of 195 million if you say it also retroactively covers the previous 5 months of 2025. So there's a little bit of gray where we hit deficit spending, depending on how you characterize these funds for 2025. Okay, so back to the total budget. Here you've got the 3 big IO proposals. Here are the amounts that are actually in the proposals. Here are the annualized amounts. If you say, hey, those are really only for the remaining 7 months, what would be the 12-month equivalent? You have the 3 big IO proposals. There are also a few little things having to do with hardware wallets, node diversity, things like that. A bunch of small proposals, all I think under 600,000. I voted on a small number of those, and that was only about 1% of my total budget. The IOG items were over 47%, over 34%, and over 13%. So these small things having to do with hardware wallets and node diversity were a very, very small portion, 1.06. And it was a small number of proposals as well. Then when you add in the Intersect MBO budget amount of 15.750 million ADA, The 2025 amount, of course, is only half of that, as we've talked about. When you add that in, that would be 3.88%. So it's a very small percent of the overall budget. But you look at the amount down here and the annualized amount, and it does put us kind of, depending on how you conceptualize the time periods here, whether it's 7 months because that's all it's left in the year, or 12 months because it's retroactive. You could argue this is a little bit of deficit spending. It's not much because the previous amount was like 194 million, and that kept us just under that limit. But we're kind of pushing the edge of deficit spending. Here's the thing, though. The vast majority of DReps aren't thinking like that. They're thinking that they can spend up to 350 million because they're not worried. A lot of them are not worried about deficit spending. Let's just face it, humans are short-term thinking animals. Maybe we think a little longer term than some other animals, but we certainly still do think on very short timelines. So a lot of the DReps are going to vote for far more than 200 million ADA budgets. So given that that's the case, I would prefer something under 200 million. But given that that's the case, that the likelihood is that the budget comes in, the final budget we approve is going to come in over 200 million. We can't just think in absolute dollar figures here. We also have to think in terms of the ratios of different things in the budget. So when I look at the percentages over here in this column H, I think this is fair. I think I'm okay with Intersect getting something under 4% of the budget. When I think about the Intersect proposal, this 15,750,000 figure, it seems like too much money. It seems like too much money for what I envision Intersect doing. When I think about it in terms of it being 4% of the overall budget, I'm kind of okay with that percentage. I mean, the IOG portions of this are much bigger in comparison. The rest of the budget, non-IOG budget that I'm voting yes for, is only 1% and 3.88%. So ratio wise, it's not it doesn't sound terrible. That less than 4% figure doesn't sound terrible. So why do I say that I still think it's too much money? Here's why. So the 15.75 million ADA at a fixed USD value of 7.875 million starts looking a little different when you see the breakdown of that amount. So you've got 950,000 for Cardano Development Holdings. Then you've got 4.875 million in payroll. So if you look at this is 4.5 million for various people at an average full-time employee salary of 100K. So you're talking about 45 guys making six figures. So there's been a lot of inflation in the world. So six figures used to be a very healthy, very, very healthy salary. Many people dreamed of having a six-figure salary back in the day. Inflation happened, and obviously a much 100,000 is worth a lot less today than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, $100,000 salary was a very healthy salary. Today, it's a lot less, but we're still talking about 45 guys, 45 people of any gender, 45 full-time employees making 100K. So I know a lot of, people in Cardano are all across the income spectrum. There are people in Cardano making huge amounts of money, and there are people in Cardano making much more regular amounts of money. But when I think about 45 people making on average 100K, that means that there's going to be a lot of people making a lot more than that, and probably some people making less than that. But that's a lot of that institutional inertia I was talking about before. If this is our first year, if in our first year we have 45 people, and we're just we know it's going to be a spectrum. Some people making less, some people making more. But if we're saying it's the equivalent of 45 people making 100K, what does it look like next year? What does it look like the year after that? And also, if you got 45 people making 100K, I think we end up hearing a lot more of the things that we don't want to hear. Like, I attended a bunch of the reconciliation workshops. Okay, I wasn't like in the Zoom call, contributing my thoughts to the call, but I watched them. I watched them on YouTube. So maybe I didn't actually participate, but at least I watched them. And you still heard you still heard people mentioning things like uh the way the Department of Defense does RFPs. So you still heard some of this like very, very bureaucratic language and people kind of implying that Intersect should be this type of organization that maybe should be doing tender offers and everybody should be, submitting their proposals to Intersect in the same manner that defense contractors submit their proposals to the Department of Defense. That's exactly what I don't want Intersect to do. I don't want Intersect to behave the same way as the biggest bureaucratic organization in the entire world, which is renowned for its inefficiency. This is the home of $900 hammers. That's exactly what we don't want. I'm a little bit afraid if we have 45 people in our very first budget, 45 people making 100K, they figure out how to create that same bureaucratic sprawl, that same inefficiency. And I know a lot of people will respond to this by saying, 100K is nothing. If you want quality people, developers cost, a quarter million for competent developers. But that's not what we're talking about here. I don't think we're talking about Intersect being involved in core development. That's what that gigantic IOG budget is for. These are for a lot of other things that are happening under the hood. I don't think we're hiring, you know, uh, Haskell developers here. I think we're hiring a lot of other different types of people. And I'm just saying, if you have 45 people making six figures in your very first budget, that's kind of the seed of that same kind of bureaucratic sprawl, the same kind of stuff where people sit around talking and eventually they're like, yeah, we should do Department of Defense style RFPs. Everybody tender your proposals. We're going to decide who gets paid for the $900 hammers. Obviously, that's not going to happen in this first year, and we're not really going to see that. But just the dollar amounts here, I'm a little bit afraid we're planting those seeds. So, what would I have liked to see here? I would like to have seen an exact accounting of who's getting how much money because we've got here an average for full-time employees of 100K, but we don't know how much the top guys are going to get paid. And I can only assume it's, the top salaries are going to be the people listed here kind of in the executive section. So, I know it's uncomfortable. Nobody wants their exact salary to be publicized to the world, but when you're doing governance, there's like a reason we know exactly how much the government salary of the senators and the people in the House of Representatives and the people in the executive branch, we know how much those people get paid. It's a matter of transparency. So I would have liked to have seen a link here laying out exactly how many people we're talking about, exactly what the roles are, just like a link to a spreadsheet or something. Maybe there is one somewhere, but I have not been able to locate it. Here we have, the number of people on committees, those kinds of things. But I would love to see, would have loved to have seen a spreadsheet that said, hey, here are all the roles that are going to be on payroll, and here's how much each of them is getting paid. That's sort of the standard that modern governments are held to. That's why we know how much Nancy Pelosi was being paid as a senator, and why people were so puzzled at her actual net worth after all these years. But but I think I would feel more comfortable with this if we knew exactly how much everybody's getting paid. What it looks like right now, and I could be wrong, maybe that document is available somewhere, but just reading through this proposal, what I see is that we're giving them $4.875 million for payroll, and they can kind of split it up however they like. Because there's a lot of ways to arrive at an average FTE amount of 100K. You could be paying the people at the top some very absurd salaries and still figure out a way to hit that average. So I do applaud the proposal authors for listing the exact compensation of the board of directors, 35,000 per director. That's perfectly in line with what I would think was reasonable for an organization like this. But the more important question, now that we've covered a lot of the considerations around this proposal, is how is the proposal actually doing? So if we come down here to poll results, you can see that 29 votes have come in and we're at 66% yes, 34% no. So this is doing quite a bit better. This is the proposal in Cardano GovTool for the 15.75 million ADA amount. And this one's doing quite well. The votes they've received so far are 66% yes. There is, however, still the old proposal for 20 million in Ecclesia. And here's where we need to talk a little bit about how the voting works differently in Ecclesia, which is the intersect budget reconciliation voting tool versus the way voting works in the Cardano Gov tool. So I know this sounds like it's going to be super boring, but we'll do it quickly and hopefully clearly. So I'm going to try not to make this super boring, and it will be short. So here is the Cardano GovTool FAQ. So what's important to understand here is how the yes percentage is calculated. So the yes percentage in Cardano GovTool is the yes total divided by total active stake. So total active stake is just the active DRep stake, not counting abstain votes. So this is important. Abstain votes are not counted as part of the denominator of this fraction. An active DRep stake is just all the voting power of DReps who are active. So all the DReps who are active minus the abstain votes is the denominator, and the numerator is just the number of yes votes. So that's how it works in Cardano GovTool. So if you abstain, you're taking your vote out of the denominator. So if you abstain in Cardano GovTools, you're actually helping the yes votes. You would think that abstain would just kind of be neutral and it wouldn't count one way or the other, but you're actually reducing the denominator, which makes it more likely the yes votes get to a higher percentage. So all of that is why you've seen a lot of people on X this weekend explaining that they're changing their vote from a no to an abstain in Cardano GovTool on that 15.75 million ADA proposal by Intersect, because changing their vote to abstain makes it more likely that the yes votes reach the required percentage. So, and there's quite a bit of pressure right now to vote in favor of those kinds of that particular proposal. Voting works totally differently in the Intersect reconciliation voting tool. So here's how it works in the reconciliation voting tool for Intersect. So inside their voting tool, it works like this. The numerator is the same, yes votes, but the denominator is just the yes plus no votes. Abstention does not impact the calculation. So in Cardano GovTool, if you abstain, it makes the denominator smaller. In the Intersect reconciliation votes, abstaining has no effect on the calculation. It's just yes plus no votes. So when you see people saying they're abstaining, it's because they want to help the vote in Cardano GovTool, but it actually doesn't make a difference at all inside the Intersect reconciliation voting tool. Speaking of the Intersect reconciliation budget voting tool, Ecclesia, how is the voting looking in Ecclesia? Well, first of all, you notice the 15.75 million budget proposal is in Cardano GovTool. We still only have the 20 million ADA budget proposal inside Ecclesia. And it looks like a lot of people have been voting on this. You'll remember previously they weren't at the 50% they needed, but now we look and by voting power, they're actually at 70%. They're already at 70%. Remember, this is just the yes votes divided by the yes votes plus the no votes. No votes are only at 16.53%. And people have been voting on this because certain influential accounts have been asking people, publicly, nothing under the table, but just openly, they've been asking people to please vote yes on this for all the reasons we've talked about in this video. But they've been directing them to at least some of those posts have been directing people to this Ecclesia vote instead of the one in Cardano GovTool. So unfortunately, this is the one for 20 million, and those votes have now gone up to 70.28%. So it looks like the vote in Cardano GovTool is at 66%. This vote is at 70%. So it looks like both of these will pass. And I believe the voting is done uh, sort of in early evening on May 5th. So the voting will be done on May 5th. And based on this, 70% of the voting power versus 16%, it looks like this one will pass. Unfortunately, we might end up in the situation where the Cardano GovTool vote for 15.75 million is a yes, because they're at 66%. And then this 20,000 ADA vote will be a yes. I'm hoping what that means is that Intersect will include in their budget the 15.75 million figure, not this 20 million figure. I think it would be a little bit of a bait and switch if they turn around and said, well, the 20 million was approved after all, so we're going to go with 20 million. I hope they only go with that 15.75 million from Cardano GovTool. So, most importantly, how am I going to vote on these proposals? Well, this proposal in Ecclesia is still for the wrong amount. This is the 20 million ADA amount. And as far as I know, this amount still shows just 2025 as being the date. It doesn't show that June 2025 to June 2026 period. So it has all the problems that the original proposal suffered from because it is the original proposal. So on this proposal, I'm going to vote no. You notice, 13% of the voting power went to abstain, even though it doesn't actually impact the vote one way or another. I'm actually going to vote no on this because this is the old amount. This isn't the current proposal. Since it's not the current proposal, I'm going to vote no on this one. This is just the internal intersect vote. This isn't really the ecosystem vote. That's the vote that takes place on Cardano GovTool. This one's the wrong amount. I'm going to vote no on this one. So in the end, I did vote yes in Cardano GovTool for this proposal for 15.75 million ADA for the full 12-month period from June 2025 to June 2026. This is a very different proposal than the 20 million just for that 7-month period from June 2025 to December 2025. So this one I did vote yes on. You can see down below here, the yes votes are now at 68%. Ultimately, that vote in Cardano GovTool was a yes because it's still such a small part of the overall budget, less than 4% compared to 47%, 13%, and 34% of the budget I voted yes for IOG, another 1% for these smaller proposals that I think are important. I think things like having hardware wallets and node diversity. I think those are important things. Maintaining our hardware wallet integrations, but I think those are important things. But 4% under 4%, I think is okay. I don't think it's going to kill us if we spend 4% of the budget on an entity that'll take care of our core code repositories, manage disbursements from the treasury, all these under the hood things. I think 4% is okay. However, I will say I think we have to have transparency on what roles and amounts are involved in that payroll number. That payroll number, which is the biggest part of this budget, uh, biggest part of this budget on sort of an annual basis. That payroll should we should have transparency into exactly what roles are going to go on the payroll and exactly how much each of those roles is being paid. We should have at least as much transparency as we have into Nancy Pelosi's salary, Elizabeth Warren's salary, the president's salary. We should know if the ecosystem treasury is giving Intersect this money. Intersect must tell us exactly who's getting paid what. I know they're going to be hesitant. Nobody wants the world to know how much they're getting paid, but the ecosystem is paying for it. This isn't like you're not a commercial entity, you're a not for profit entity. So I think we need to have that transparency into exactly what roles are getting paid what amount of money. I'll be very disappointed if Intersect doesn't give us transparency into those amounts and exactly which role. Hey, the head of the organization is getting paid this amount per year. There are this many other roles involved, and each of them is getting paid this amount, and there are this many people in each of those roles. We should have that level of transparency into these amounts. Having said that, I'm okay with this being less than 4%. It is slightly over the 200 million net change limit that I did vote for, but it's not ridiculous when people say, hey, this 96 million for input output engineering, the core development budget, it's not really an annualized 165 million because we never paid them anything for January through May. So it really is for 2025, it really is this amount right here. Research really is this amount right here. Catalyst really is this amount right here. These are all retroactive to the beginning of January. However, when it comes time for the 2026 budget to be passed, that doesn't mean I'm going to buy into the logic that we should give them these amounts for 2026. I think these amounts on a yearly basis are much better than these amounts. So next year, just because we gave them these amounts in, say, we don't know when it'll actually be dispersed, but maybe June 1st, just because we gave them these amounts for June through December, thinking that those are retroactive to reward them for the work that was done for free, going back to January, that doesn't mean that next year I'll be in favor of these amounts because I think these amounts, you know, they kind of make sense. This amount, for half the year kind of makes sense. This amount for 12 months kind of makes sense. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to be in favor of this kind of budget, which definitely is deficit spending in 2026. This amount for all of 2025 is not deficit spending. So I think we can survive on this kind of budget. Having said that, other DReps are going to be thinking about this net change limit of 350. So other DReps are voting for a much more expansive budget. And what we see come out of Intersect is certainly not going to be this 203 million number that, in my mind, is not deficit spending. It's certainly going to be a number that probably includes a decent amount of deficit spending. So voting on the actual budget that comes out of Intersect might be a very different matter than voting for this money to run Intersect and this money for these proposals. So we'll see what comes out of Intersect. Otherwise, I hope you're having a great start to May, and I'll talk to you soon.